He thought he could humiliate her, until her fingers touched the keys and left the entire room speechless. A rich man forced her to play piano to embarrass her, but her talent destroyed him instead. The grand ballroom of the Regal Crest Hotel shimmered under crystal chandeliers. The city's elite, business tycoons, politicians, and socialites mingled over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. At the center of the room stood a polished grand piano, reserved for the evening's entertainment. Lucas Harrington, a self-made millionaire with a reputation for ruthless deals and a disdain for those he deemed beneath him, held court near the stage. His sharp suit and cold smirk exuded arrogance. Across the room, Ella Carter, a 28-year-old waitress with a quiet grace, moved between tables, balancing trays with practiced ease. Ella had been working double shifts to save for music school, a dream she'd put on hold after her mother's illness. But tonight, fate had other plans. The hum of conversation and clinking glasses filled the Regal Crest Hotel's grand ballroom, a symphony of wealth and privilege that echoed off the gilded walls. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the elite attendees, men in tailored tuxedos, women in designer gowns that shimmered like liquid jewels. At the center of it all stood Lucas Harrington, a man whose reputation for ruthless business acumen was matched only by his arrogance. His sharp features were fixed in a perpetual smirk, as if the world existed solely for his amusement. A half-empty glass of expensive whiskey dangled from his fingers, the ice long since melted, forgotten in his latest pursuit of entertainment. His gaze, cold and assessing, swept across the room before landing on Ella Carter. She moved through the crowd with quiet efficiency, balancing a silver tray of champagne flutes with practiced ease. Her uniform, a simple black dress and white apron, marked her as part of the staff, invisible to most of the guests. But to Lucas, she was a target. There was something about her composure, the way she carried herself with an unspoken dignity, that irked him. To a man like Lucas, who thrived on dominance, humility was a weakness to be exploited. Leading toward his circle of equally smug associates, Lucas let out a derisive chuckle. "Look at that," he murmured, nodding in Ella's direction. "Bet she's never even touched a piano before. Probably thinks a concerto is something you order at an Italian restaurant." His friends laughed on cue, their voices dripping with condescension. One of them, a hedge fund manager with a penchant for cruelty, added, "Should we ask her to play? Might be the most entertainment we get all night." The suggestion hung in the air, charged with malice. Lucas's lips curled into a grin. The idea was too perfect, a way to assert his dominance, to remind everyone in the room of their place. Without hesitation, he tapped his whiskey glass sharply with a spoon, the metallic ping. Cutting through the murmur of the crowd, conversations faltered, heads turned. The room's attention was his, just as he preferred. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lucas announced, his voice smooth and mocking, "we have a special performance for you tonight." He gestured grandly toward Ella, who had paused near the edge of the room, her tray still in hand. "Our lovely waitress here has just informed me that she's quite the pianist. Isn't that right?" Ella's breath caught. The weight of dozens of eyes suddenly fixed on her made her skin prickle. She had said no such thing, hadn't even spoken to Lucas all evening. Her fingers tightened around the tray as she shook her head slightly. I didn't say that, sir," she replied, her voice steady but low. Lucas feigned surprise, placing a hand over his heart in exaggerated offense. "Oh, come now, don't be modest." He turned back to the crowd, playing to his audience. "What do you all say? Should we give her a chance to impress us?" The room erupted in a mix of hesitant applause and nervous laughter. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the cruelty in Lucas's game, but unwilling to challenge him. Others, eager for spectacle, egged him on. Ella's pulse thundered in her ears. She knew exactly what Lucas was doing. He wanted to humiliate her, to turn her into a joke for his amusement. The thought of stepping up to that piano, of subjecting herself to their judgment, sent a wave of nausea through her. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. A quiet, simmering defiance. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, expectant. Lucas arched a brow, his smirk widening. "Well, don't keep us waiting." For a heartbeat, Ella considered refusing. She could walk away, endure the laughter, and fade back into the anonymity of service staff. But then her gaze flickered to the piano, its polished surface gleaming under the lights, the keys waiting, untouched. Memories flooded her, her mother's hands guiding hers over the keys of their old, out-of-tune upright piano. The hours spent practicing until her fingers ached. The dream she had buried when reality demanded sacrifice. Slowly, deliberately, she set her tray down on a nearby table. The room seemed to hold its breath as she stepped toward the piano. Lucas's grin turned triumphant, but Ella didn't look at him. She focused only on the instrument ahead, the one thing in this gilded cage that felt like hers. As she settled onto the bench, the crowd's whispers crescendoed. Some guests exchanged skeptical glances. Others leaned forward, intrigued. Lucas crossed his arms, already preparing his next mocking remark. But then Ella's hands hovered over the keys, and the world stilled. And then she played. The first notes rang out, clear and resonant, cutting through the tension like a knife. Chopin's Ballade No. 1. A piece of staggering complexity, of raw emotion, flowed from her fingers as if they had a life of their own. The room gasped collectively. The music swelled, filling every corner of the ballroom, wrapping around the stunned guests like a spell. Lucas's champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. His smirk vanished, replaced by stunned disbelief. The crowd's murmurs died instantly, replaced by awed silence. Ella didn't notice. Her eyes closed, her body swayed slightly with the rhythm, lost in the music she had loved since childhood. Every note was a rebellion. Every chord was a reclaiming. And Lucas Harrington, the man who had sought to break her, could only stand there, utterly, devastatingly humbled. The grand ballroom of the Regal Crest Hotel seemed to shrink as Ella Carter's fingers made contact with the ivory keys. A hush fell over the assembled crowd, so complete that the faintest whisper would have echoed like a shout. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation, thick with the unspoken judgment of the elite audience, and the cruel amusement of Lucas Harrington and his cronies. For one terrible, suspended moment, nothing happened. Then the first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor cascaded through the room like a sudden summer storm. Ella's hands moved with the unconscious grace of a natural musician, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with precision that belied her humble waitress uniform. The opening bars of the piece, haunting, melancholic, and deceptively simple, rippled through the silent ballroom. Guests who had been leaning forward in their seats, anticipating a humiliating spectacle, now froze in place, their smirks fading into expressions of shock. The delicate phrasing, the perfect control of dynamics, the subtle rubato, these were not the hallmarks of an amateur, but of a true artist. As the music swelled into the first dramatic climax, a transformation came over Ella. The hesitant waitress who had approached the piano with downcast eyes was gone, replaced by a performer of commanding presence. Her posture straightened, her shoulders relaxed, and her face took on an expression of intense concentration mixed with something approaching rapture. The music seemed to flow through her entire body. She swayed slightly with the rhythm, her foot pressing the sustained pedal with instinctive timing. The notes poured forth like liquid emotion, filling every corner of the ornate ballroom. The technical mastery alone would have been impressive, but what truly captivated the audience was the depth of feeling Ella brought to the performance. Each phrase told a story, of struggle, of longing, of quiet triumph. The melancholic opening gave way to passages of fiery passion, then returned to moments of heartbreaking tenderness. A society matron near the front dabbed discreetly at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. A renowned music critic, who had been chatting idly with a colleague moments before, now stood transfixed, his mouth slightly open in astonishment. At the center of this unfolding drama stood Lucas Harrington, his carefully constructed facade of smug superiority crumbling by the measure. The glass of whiskey in his hand tilted dangerously as his fingers went slack, the amber liquid spilling unnoticed onto the polished marble floor. His lips, which had been curled in a mocking smirk just minutes before, now parted in shock. The color drained from his face as the realization dawned. He had sought to humiliate this woman, only to unwittingly showcase her extraordinary talent before the very people whose respect he craved most. The music built toward its famous coda, a tempestuous whirlwind of notes that tests even the most skilled pianists. Ella attacked this section with breathtaking precision, her fingers flying across the keys in a blur of motion. The sheer physicality of her performance was mesmerizing, the muscles in her forearms tensing and releasing, her whole body engaged in the creation of this musical storm. The final thunderous chords rang out with such power that several guests actually flinched, as if struck by physical force. Then came the delicate, heartbreaking resolution, a whisper of sound that faded into perfect silence. For 3 full seconds after the last note died away, the ballroom remained utterly still. Then, as if released from a collective trance, the audience erupted. The standing ovation began at the front tables and spread through the room like wildfire. Cheers and applause filled the air, louder and more sincere than any of the polite receptions given to the evening's previous performers. Ella, her hands still hovering above the keys, blinked as if waking from a dream. The sudden return to reality seemed almost painful. The bright lights, the sea of astonished faces, the deafening applause. At the edge of the crowd, a distinguished older gentleman pushed his way forward. Maxwell Thornton, the renowned conductor of the New York Philharmonic, had tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "My dear," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "that was. I have heard this piece performed by the greatest pianists of our time, but never with such." He trailed off, shaking his head in wonder. Behind him, a crowd was forming. Wealthy patrons, music lovers, even some of Lucas's former sycophants, all eager to speak with this extraordinary musician who had appeared in their midst like a gift. Meanwhile, Lucas found himself pushed to the periphery, his expensive suit and family name suddenly meaningless in the face of genuine artistry. His carefully cultivated image lay in tatters, not because of any direct attack from Ella, but simply by the unavoidable comparison between his petty cruelty and her luminous talent. The whispers around him were no longer the admiring murmurs he was accustomed to, but shocked condemnations of his behavior. Did you see how he tried to embarrass her? Imagine being that arrogant and then being shown up like that. The social currency he had spent years accumulating was evaporating before his eyes. Ella, for her part, seemed almost overwhelmed by the sudden attention. She answered questions with quiet humility, her earlier transformation back into the unassuming waitress, though now no one in the room would ever see her that way again. When asked where she had studied, she mentioned a small conservatory that had closed years ago and the private lessons she had given up when her mother fell ill. The more she spoke, the more apparent it became that this level of artistry had been achieved not through privilege and connections, but through raw talent and relentless dedication. As the crowd around Ella grew, a server approached with a tray of champagne, not for the guests, but for Ella herself. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. In the space of 10 minutes, she had gone from serving drinks to being served, from invisible staff to the undisputed center of attention. The hierarchy of the evening had been upended completely, and everyone present knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just a musical performance, but the unmasking of true character. The echoes of that performance would linger long after the final notes had faded. Contracts would be offered, careers launched, reputations made and broken. But in that moment, as the applause finally began to die down, and the guests reluctantly returned to their conversations. One truth stood clear. Lucas Harrington had sought to diminish someone he considered beneath him, only to discover that true greatness cannot be measured by wealth or status. And Ella Carter, who had come to work an ordinary shift serving canapés to the wealthy, had instead served them a lesson they would never forget. The moment Ella's final notes faded into stunned silence, the atmosphere in the Regal Crest's ballroom underwent a seismic shift. The air itself seemed charged with electricity, every guest holding their breath as the reality of what they'd just witnessed settled over them. That perfect, suspended silence lasted only 3 heartbeats, just long enough for Lucas Harrington's champagne flute to slip from his numb fingers and shatter explosively against the marble floor, before the room erupted in a standing ovation that shook the crystal chandeliers. The transformation of the crowd's attitude was both instantaneous and absolute. Wealthy socialites who had barely glanced at their waitstaff all evening now surged toward the piano with tears glistening in their expertly made-up eyes. Business magnates who measured human worth in stock portfolios suddenly found themselves applauding a woman whose annual salary likely equaled what they spent on weekly spa treatments. The very people who had moments earlier been complicit in Lucas's cruel joke now tripped over themselves to praise Ella's brilliance, their fickle allegiances shifting with the wind of genuine talent. At the epicenter of this adulation stood Ella herself, her fingers still lightly resting on the piano keys as if reluctant to break contact. The quiet waitress who had moved invisibly through the crowd now found herself the unwilling center of attention, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock and residual creative euphoria. As the first wave of well-wishers reached her, she stood slowly, her simple black waitress uniform suddenly seeming like the most elegant attire in the room compared to the gaudy excess surrounding her. A distinguished silver-haired gentleman, Maxwell Thornton, the New York Philharmonic's principal conductor, reached her first, his normally composed features alight with undisguised awe. "My dear," Thornton breathed, grasping both her hands with surprising strength. "That was quite possibly the most extraordinary interpretation of Chopin I've heard in 40 years of professional music." His voice broke slightly on the composer's name. "Where did you study? Who was your teacher?" The questions came rapid-fire, his excitement making him seem decades younger. Ella's response, that she'd attended a small conservatory that closed due to funding cuts, that her primary teacher had been a retired Juilliard professor, giving discounted lessons in a Harlem church basement, sent murmurs rippling through the crowd. The irony was too perfect. This world-class talent had been hiding in plain sight, polishing silverware and refilling water glasses, while New York's elite paid hundreds for concert tickets to hear far inferior performers. Meanwhile, at the periphery of the crowd, Lucas Harrington stood frozen in a nightmare of his own making. The smug amusement that had characterized his features all evening had drained away, leaving behind a waxen mask of shock. His carefully cultivated aura of invincibility, that unshakable belief in his own superiority that had carried him from middle-class obscurity to the pinnacle of high society, crumbled with each ecstatic review shouted over the din. The broken glass at his feet seemed symbolic. His carefully constructed persona lay similarly shattered. As if the universe sought to twist the knife further, Lucas's most important business contact, Charles Winthrop, CEO of a Fortune 500 company Lucas had been courting for months, pushed past him without a glance to join the throng surrounding Ella. "Miss Carter," Winthrop boomed, his patrician voice cutting through the noise. "My wife and I have box seats at the Met, but I haven't heard playing like that since Horowitz. You simply must allow me to introduce you to our Arts Foundation board." The speed with which the power dynamics shifted would have been comical under different circumstances. Waitstaff members whom Lucas had snapped his fingers at all evening now looked at him with barely concealed scorn, while society matrons who had laughed at his jokes an hour earlier pointedly turned their backs. A particularly brutal moment came when Cynthia Van der Ling, whose annual charity gala was the most coveted invitation in Manhattan. Aya kissed Ella on both cheeks while deliberately stepping on Lucas's fallen handkerchief. The cruelest twist of all, Ella herself showed no gloating, no vindictiveness. When someone mentioned Lucas's role in her impromptu performance, she simply said, "I suppose I should thank him for the opportunity," with such genuine lack of malice that it somehow made Lucas's humiliation complete. Her grace under the spotlight only highlighted his pettiness, her talent underscoring his lack of substance. By evening's end, 3 separate music directors had pressed business cards into Ella's hands. A prominent arts patron had offered to fund her return to formal training, and Lucas had slunk away virtually unnoticed. The man who would forever be remembered not for his business acumen or wealth, but as the fool who accidentally showcased genius while trying to mock it. The waitress he'd sought to humiliate had, with 20 minutes of transcendent music, exposed the hollow core of his carefully constructed world. And as the last guests departed still buzzing about the evening's unexpected highlight, the hotel staff shared knowing smiles. They'd always known Ella was special. Now finally, so did everyone else. The months following Ella Carter's impromptu performance at the Regal Crest Hotel unfolded like a dream she had long since stopped believing in. That single night, sparked by cruelty, transformed by music, had unraveled the carefully stitched seams of her old life and rewoven them into something extraordinary. The moment her fingers had left the piano keys, she had stepped into a new reality, one where her talent was no longer a secret, no longer something to be tucked away between double shifts and unpaid bills. The first call came before she had even changed out of her waitress uniform. Maxwell Thornton, the silver-haired conductor who had been the first to reach her after her performance, had waited outside the hotel in his town car, unwilling to let her slip away without securing her contact information. By dawn, his assistant had emailed a formal invitation, an audition with the New York Philharmonic, not as a fill-in musician, but as a featured soloist for their upcoming season. Ella had read the email 3 times, her fingers trembling over her phone screen, before the reality of it settled in. Then came Charles Winthrop's offer, a full scholarship to Juilliard, funded by his family's arts foundation. It was an opportunity she had once scraped and saved for, only to watch it dissolve when her mother fell ill. Now, it was being handed to her with no strings attached, just the quiet insistence that the world deserved to hear her play. And then, the recording contract. A producer from Decca Classics, who had been in the audience that night, tracked her down through the hotel's employment records. He arrived at her tiny Bronx apartment with a contract in hand and a bewildered expression, as if he couldn't quite believe he was offering a record deal to a woman whose resume listed Waitress as her most recent profession. The unraveling of Lucas Harrington. While Ella's star ascended, Lucas Harrington's carefully constructed empire of influence began to crumble. The society pages, once enamored with his ruthless charm, now painted him as the villain of Ella's story. A particularly damning editorial in The New York Times, titled, "The Arrogance of Assuming Talent Has a Class," dissected his behavior that night and exposed a pattern of similar slights towards service staff over the years. Old acquaintances distanced themselves, not out of moral outrage, but out of sheer social self-preservation. No one wanted to be associated with the man who had become shorthand for entitled cruelty. His business ventures suffered next. The Winthrop deal, a merger that would have cemented his financial legacy, vanished overnight when Charles Winthrop publicly withdrew his support, citing a fundamental misalignment of values. Other investors followed suit, their retreats couched in polite corporate jargon, but unmistakable in meaning. By the time Ella's debut album topped the classical charts, Lucas had become a ghost in his own life. He spent his days in near isolation in his penthouse, the very apartment where he had once hosted lavish parties for the city's elite. Now, the only calls he received were from reporters seeking comment on Ella's latest triumph, requests he ignored. Ella's debut. A full circle moment. The night of Ella's Carnegie Hall debut was more than a concert. It was a reckoning. The venue, steeped in over a century of musical history, was sold out weeks in advance. Critics who had attended out of curiosity, could this waitress turned virtuoso really be as good as the hype? Left in stunned silence, their hastily scribbled notes filled with words like transcendent and once in a generation. In the front row, her mother, now recovered, now beaming, clutched the hand of the retired Juilliard professor who had taught Ella in that Harlem church basement. Nearby, hotel staff from the Regal Crest sat in seats that normally cost thousands, their presence a quiet testament to the family Ella had built long before fame found her. And then the encore. Ella returned to the stage, the applause still roaring around her, and settled once more at the grand piano. But instead of launching into another classical showpiece, she paused. The crowd hushed. "This one," she said softly into the microphone, "is for anyone who's ever been told they don't belong somewhere." Her fingers found the opening notes of that Chopin Ballade, the same piece she had played the night everything changed. But this time, there was no cruelty behind the invitation to perform. No smug audience waiting for her to fail. Just a room full of people holding their breath as she spun gold from the keys once more. The legacy of that night. Years later, when music historians analyzed Ella Carter's meteoric rise, they would point to that evening at the Regal Crest as the catalyst. But those who knew her best understood the truth. The real turning point hadn't been the performance itself, but the moment she chose to walk toward the piano instead of away from it. As for Lucas, he eventually left New York, not in disgrace, exactly, but in quiet obsolescence. The business world moved on without him. The society pages forgot him. And on the rare occasions when someone mentioned his name in Ella's presence, she would simply smile and change the subject. Because in the end, his greatest humiliation wasn't her success. It was the realization, too late, that he had never been the protagonist of this story at all. On the cover of T.I. Amy magazine's 100 Most Influential People issue, Ella Carter smiled serenely, her fingers arched over a piano keyboard. The headline read, "The Woman Who Redefined Excellence." Somewhere, in a modest apartment far from Manhattan, a discarded copy of that magazine lay on a coffee table. Unread. The owner already knew the story.